A hard truth about book industry YouTube is that it is very easy to find advice on writing and much, much more difficult to find advice on revising. And unfortunately, what this leads to is so many people misunderstanding the process of revising to such a degree that they can spoil their book. So today, I want to talk about the actual process of how to revise your finished manuscript. Stay tuned. You've got the story, you've got the idea, you just don't know the steps in the process. If this is what's holding your memoir back, I have got the solution for you. The Memoir Method Checklist is going to take you through every single step you need from idea to published marketable book. And you can download it now at pageandpodium.com/checklist. As the owner and founder of a memoir-focused publishing company, I have many conversations with authors about the revision process. In fact, when authors publish with us, we have revision support included because revisions are arguably the most important part in the process of writing and publishing your book. I say all that because I want to emphasize once again in our 4-part series on revising how important it is that you are really moving into the revision stage, understanding it as a stage. And that's why today we are rounding out this 4-part series by thinking about revision as a process. Now I'm going to do this in 2 parts. The first thing that I want to do is go through the actual process that we suggest when folks are revising their memoir. And then I want to give you 4 ways to think about this process that I think are going to help you really feel a lot more empowered, a lot more ready to tackle something that is new. Most of us have written things before, but most of us actually have never revised anything. So with that little bit of a teaser, let me get into my kind of first opening bit before we get into those 2 pieces of this video. So the first thing I want to do is once again emphasize the difference between revising and editing. Now I know I've done this on the previous videos in this series, so I'm not going to belabor it here, but I think it's worth mentioning. When we think about revising, we are talking about higher level changes. So these are often areas that need to be moved from one part of your book to another. Sometimes it is a larger scale cut. And almost always, there will be new material that you need to write. On the other side of the coin, we have editing. Now, when we're thinking about editing, this is, by the way, what many people call revising. What we are doing is going in at a line level. So this is going to be things like, is the prose beautiful? Do I like the structure of this sentence? Do I think I picked the best word here? Do I need to kind of clarify this point a bit more? Editing is going to be something that you can do at the line level, at the paragraph level. You can do a page at a time if you want to. With revising, you will need to do that at a 10,000-foot view. With revising, we need to get you out of the weeds that you got into when you were writing those chapters and back into this larger, higher level overview of what we've got to work with. Okay, so that said, I do want to make sure that as we move forward, you are really thinking about this as something that is different from kind of tweaking away at your manuscript. Revising is something that you will need to have a plan. And let me give a little kind of note here, give me just a second, to say that in our group program for women writing their first memoir, the Memoir Method, we do have a setup that is specifically for you if you have a whole manuscript and you're coming into this revising stage. What I find is that oftentimes people do have some sense that they need to do more than just editing, but they really don't know how to structure that process. That is one thing that the group program can give for you. So if you're interested in that, head over to pageandpodium.com/contact. You can schedule a quick call with me. We can make sure you're a great fit for the program. And if not, I'll tell you that too. But for now, Download the Memoir Method checklist so that you can kind of follow along with this process. If you don't have that, that's at pageandpodium.com/checklist. And we are on page 3, going down these different steps that you'll need to take in the revision stage. So the first stage that we always recommend that you do in revision is if you have your chapters in separate documents, now's the time to compile them. Now, this is so exciting. And in fact, just a couple of weeks ago, one of our Memoir Method people had just posted in our Circle app that she compiled her whole manuscript and printed it. And it was beautiful to see that stack of paper. So this is going to be a really rewarding thing for you to do. And in fact, the first stage we recommend in revision is celebrating. Once you get to the point of revision, you have done a huge amount of work, and we really want to make sure that we are acknowledging that. Yes, it needs to be revised, but no, that doesn't mean that you did a bad job. You did an amazing job finishing that draft, and we're going to dive right in. So compile all those chapters. It'll give you a sense of what your starting word count is, which can be really helpful. And it's just going to help you kind of get in that mindset that we're not picking. We're not at the chapter level anymore. We are now at the book level. So compile all of that stuff together. Then the second thing we want you to do is do what's called a reverse outline. Now this, like compiling your chapters, is partly a mindset thing. What we're trying to get you to do here is really be able to see what you have to work with. You did all of these many months of writing. In most cases, this is quite a long process. So of course, you're not going to remember with all that much clarity what you were doing in chapter 1 and 2 and 3. Certainly not as much as you will remember from 17, 18, and 19. So what we want to do then, after we have put together all of these chapters into one document, is now you are going to comb through page by page, paragraph by paragraph, chapter by chapter, and you are going to effectively make an outline of what you've already written. Now, the format does not matter, as with most outlines in the literary industry. All we need is that you have got a really clear sense of which chapter you're talking about. So we'll put chapter 1. And then as you read through the chapter, with each change in topic or tone or purpose, whatever it might be, you're going to put just a word or phrase under that chapter heading to indicate what was there. So was this a scene, a particular type of scene? Write that down. Was this a particular type of analysis? Write that down. Was this some kind of bit of wisdom or framing device that you got from your education or professional training? Write that down. The goal is that we end with an outline of your book, but it's not an outline you're going to use to rewrite or start writing from. Rather, this is an outline that we're going to use just to be really honest about what's there. And oftentimes, as people go through this process, I find that they actually have a lot more knowledge of what needs to happen than they often think. So let me give you one example. So we published this book about a year ago. It's called The Work in Between by Gretchen Norling Holmes. Go pick this book up. It is so inspiring. But one thing that Gretchen really wanted to talk about was as she went through an enormously transformative process of losing over 100 pounds and then having cancer and surviving 3 different times, the message that she really wanted to share was about how we kind of heal ourselves, how we kind of look within ourselves and find that energy and that strength and that grace and all those things that we need to move forward with a lot of joy and happiness. And she really wanted to make sure that that message came through throughout the book. What that meant is that as she was doing her reverse outline, she noticed that early in the book, she was really just telling the story, right? She was trying to get out the steps of the things that happened, the plot points, we might call them. But as she got into the second half of the book, we started to get a lot more of the lessons. And in fact, the first half of the book read mostly as a pretty just standard narrative, whereas the second half of the book read much more like a self-help book. Now for us, this is no problem because Page and Podium specializes in this type of hybrid memoir where we are balancing the story with the message or the wisdom or the learnings or whatever it might be. But of course, we need those to be integrated, right? Someone who picks up a hybrid memoir does not want a self-help book, and they don't want a straight-up narrative. They want both. Well, as Gretchen outlined through, it was very, very clear to her what needed to happen, what she needed to change. And in fact, that was a great way to kickstart her revision process. I know you're going to find that this is true too, whatever the particulars of your process might be. So as you go through and work on that reverse outline, really try to keep an open mind, and most importantly, stay out of the weeds. Remember that what we are doing is looking at the 10,000-foot structural view. We are not looking at the line level. We'll get there, but we're not looking at that yet. Okay, so that is the first thing you're gonna do. You're gonna compile, you're gonna do a reverse outline, and then you're gonna analyze. You'll see in the checklist that we have a couple of things you can think about and a couple of additional follow-up videos that you can watch to help walk you through this process a bit. But the main thing that we're trying to do here is just really see what we've got, see what we think kind of in our gut, what is gonna need to change. Now around this time, this can also be a helpful time to get a manuscript review. Although, I wanna give you a caveat because I don't want you to rush out and hire an editor before it's time. If, as you do your reverse outline, you know that there are things that need to change, I want you to trust yourself. I want you to believe that you seeing that means that it really is something to fix and that you can fix it. Because I bet in many cases you can. So the first thing that you should be doing is making the revisions that you saw clearly for yourself by doing the reverse outline. But if once that's done, you'd really like to have a second set of eyes, particularly professional set of eyes, that is very, very appropriate at this stage. So at this point then, you can seek out either a manuscript review. This is what we do at Page and Podium. It's really designed to kind of give you step-by-step revision instructions. Or you can get a developmental edit. Those are also really great. They're going to give you just a lot more kind of analysis and a lot more it'll be a little bit more abstract than kind of concrete suggestions that Page and Podium gives. Either of these is great. It just depends on what you like. And at that point, you're going to have to step back and do the whole thing again. This is a process and there's no way around it. But from that point, when you get that outside feedback, you're going to go through, make yourself a plan. What do you want to change and how will you change it? Go through and make those revisions. And then the next step, rinse and repeat. With revision, we often need to do multiple rounds of revision before we are ready to move into what more accurately might be called editing. Before we are ready to get in there and do the really fun part of making those sentences feel so beautiful and adding the poetry and making sure that the metaphors sing and all that jazz. It's so good. We gotta wait till page 4 of the checklist, right? First, we need to do page 3, rinse and repeat until we know that that book is solid. We know we have done everything at the larger scale that we could want to do. Okay, so then at that point, we will have moved through this whole process. Hopefully we're feeling pretty good, and that is the point at which you're gonna go seek out the help of a copy editor. You're gonna start going through at the line level and making those changes. And as you do, I wanna give you 4 kind of mindset shifts, four ways to think about this process that I think can make it a lot easier to tackle. Unfortunately, oftentimes a phrase that myself and my writing colleagues will say to each other is that we are in the thick of revisions, and there is a reason we say that. It is, revision feels very thick. It feels like a slog sometimes. So without further ado, what are the 4 ways that you can think about this process of revision that might feel a little bit better to you? Well, we started this revision series thinking about what type of draft you have. And thanks to my right hand in the memoir method, Emily Thrash, we have this very clever metaphor of the types of houses. And all of these building metaphors work, by the way, because memoir is so much a craft. Oftentimes we want to think about kind of the art and the creativity and the poetry, and those things are part of memoir, to be sure. But really, when we think about writing a memoir, craft is very often the most salient way to think about that. When we think about building something, assembling the pieces together, making sure that they are structurally sound, these are the things that memoirists struggle with, because these are the things that are harder in your own story versus fiction or a biography of someone else. So that is all to say, we like these construction metaphors. They are really, really helpful. So I want to give you one more. When you think about the process of revision, I want you to think about the process that you would take to build really anything out of wood. Even if you haven't done this, I think it'll still resonate. When we build things out of wood, we go through the process of compiling. We go to Lowe's or whatever hardware store, we get all our wood. I prefer to use a drill and screws. Maybe you like to nail things, that feels more old school, but either way, we are putting things together in the way that is going to serve the final product, make sure it is lasting, make sure that it is enjoyable and useful for the person that will use it. As we go through that process, we very often get in the weeds of the individual things that we're trying to do with that bench or that birdhouse or whatever it may be. But when we get to the end, there can be a temptation to just paint the thing, right? And yet, I think most of us know that when we are working with raw wood, it probably needs to be finished a little more first, right? And that is the same thing with revision. When we think about revision, we are thinking of the same way that we would finish a piece of wood. We need to start with the roughest grit sandpaper, really, really rough, scratchy, right? We need to start with that to get the edge off that wood. Then we can go progressively finer and finer and finer pieces of sandpaper so that we can get that surface smoother and smoother and smoother. But if you try to use that very fine grit sandpaper on a piece of wood that you have not sanded at all yet, it's probably just gonna ruin the sandpaper, right? You're not gonna end up with a smooth piece of wood. And at that point, it doesn't even matter how strong that structure you built was, because you're trying to skip a stage that really matters to that thing being useful and beautiful. Same is true in writing. If we try to move straight ahead to polishing the prose, we are very often skipping all of the structural stuff that we might need to make sure we shore up. Same thing, we've got to start with the coarsest grade sandpaper and move down to the finest grade sandpaper. So as you are revising, I want you to think of it that way. There are a couple of reasons I think this is helpful. One, when we think about this kind of progressively finer sandpaper, I do find that helps people kind of comfort themselves. While it can seem as though, oh my gosh, this is kind of my last chance, I really want to do a good job this time. Unfortunately, we've got to trust the process, we've got to embrace it, we've got to find the joy in progressively refining our work, making it better and better and better and better and better, while maintaining all of the things we have so carefully put in place before. That is the same thing here. So when we think of this kind of sandpaper metaphor, remind yourself, you're doing this intentionally. This is not something you're doing slowly because you don't know how to do it. You're doing it intentionally. And the second thing that I think is so helpful about this sandpaper metaphor is it really reminds us that this is us, right? We are in there, we are doing that work. When you think of sanding a piece of wood, it's actually quite difficult. There is a reason that power sanders exist. But there's also something that is so fulfilling and rewarding about your own hands being used to work those materials, about you being in there, in the thick of it, learning and refining and growing, and honestly, seeing what that thing you built could be. Because it is hardly ever the case that you have a full vision of how excellent that memoir could be when you finished your first draft. We've just got to go through the labor of love that is sanding that piece before we can fully appreciate what we have built. Okay, the second way I want you to think about this process is to really focus on what I've talked about on this channel before, the sunk cost fallacy. Unfortunately, so often we don't want to make changes to our manuscript because we feel like we're kind of giving up on the work that we've already done. You know, if you watch this channel, that is not what is happening. But it is very tempting in the revision process to really want to hold on to that thing that we built because we're afraid we're going to mess it up. Understandable. The thing I want you to remind yourself is that when you are holding on to a first draft and holding on to that rough draft, and holding on means that you are resisting those revisions, what you are really doing is holding on to something okay and letting go of something excellent. Instead, I want you to do the opposite. I want you to let go of that thing that is okay. I want you to let go of that first draft and embrace what it could be. So really resist this urge to get kind of connected to what you've done and make sure that you don't make any big changes. Revision is often very big changes, and it will be scary. It will feel like you have just pulled everything out of your closet and now it's on the floor and you kind of wish you could have just left it in there. But as with any closet cleaning, as with any kind of project like this, eventually you will see that things come together and they feel a lot better than they did when you started. And in fact, that is the third way that I want you to think about revision. I have good news. As someone who has revised many books, as someone who has worked with many, many people to revise their books, I can tell you that as shaky and uncertain as it feels when you get started, there will be a point at each kind of step, each kind of stage, where you will feel things lock into place, where you will start to feel like, I get it. I get what I was trying to do, and I get what it's gonna look like, and I get how it feels, and this is right. Now, the reason I want you to keep this in mind is because, of course, it's encouraging, but also because if you can keep that in mind, that there will be a point where it locks into place, you can allow yourself to be much, much freer about making the changes you know you need to make. That is such a scary thing when we are in this space of taking our manuscript and pulling it apart and figuring out what it should be. Ooh, it's so scary. But I promise you, keep at it, push through the pain, and you will eventually get to a point where you realize that it was so valuable for you to have done that. It'll click into place and you will know you have done it right. And the fourth way that I want you to think about this is I want you to think about whether it is actually worth it to you. Now, this is a little bit of a deviation from what we've been doing in this series so far, but I gently want to introduce the idea that you might have written a first draft, and that might have been what you needed to do. So, when we are revising, really what we're aiming for is the pleasure of the reader, right? We're aiming for the marketability of the book, usually within either the book industry, agents, editors, publishers, and or the enjoyment of the reader. And when we're doing that, we're really taking the focus off of you and what you're getting from it. So the reason I want to bring up that kind of duality is that there are many, many people who are served by doing that first draft. The thing they needed was the catharsis and the healing and the sharing and the documenting and the legacy. And if that's you, you're off the hook. If you don't want to revise, you don't have to. So I say this because oftentimes I think folks feel like either their manuscript is kind of like it's a lost cause, or, oh no, it doesn't need to have much done to it. As you have learned through this series, usually neither of those is true. Most people do need to revise quite substantially if it's a first draft, and most people are not a lost cause. Most people have something that we can build and grow from. It's not an either or. What it is a question of whether it is worth it to you to have the outcome of a published book. Because if it is, dive in, it's gonna feel so good. But if it's not, think about if it's not worth it to you, maybe it's not worth it to you. There is no pressure to revise just because bozos like me are telling you to on the internet. Okay, so armed with those kind of 4 mental maps, kind of ways to think about this process that you're setting out into, I know that you are going to have such a rewarding experience of revision. Now, it's hard to think about going into a new rewarding experience when you just finished the rewarding experience of writing, I know. But if you can trust this process, if you can move forward and really listen to your gut, really hear yourself in your authentic expression, this is going to be just as rewarding, just as enjoyable an experience as the writing was. We got to get our mindset right, and our mindset involves the process. Okay, if I can help, if it would be really useful to have some extra support, to have some training materials, to have expert guidance and a community of people going through the same thing you are, I really want you to reach out. I would love to welcome you into the Memoir Method as your strategy for revising this book. Head over to pageandpodium.com/memoir-method to learn more, or pageandpodium.com/contact if you are ready to set up that clarity call with me and make sure this program will be a perfect fit. In the meantime, happy reverse outlining, happy revising, and as always, happy writing. You know what they say, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. And this is exactly what holds so many people back on their memoir projects. That is exactly why we created the Memoir Method Checklist, a full, complete list of every single step you need to take to get that memoir written, published, and marketed successfully. You can download it now at pageandpodium.com/checklist.